The Xenoblade series has some amazing stories, and by extent, some amazing villains. But that makes it so that the few subpar villains stand out so much more. I don't think there are that many terrible Xenoblade antagonists, but I thought it could still be fun to look at the 5 worst of them. There are many different reasons why a villain can make this list. Them being uninteresting, generic, or them just not doing much throughout the story can all be possible reasons. However, bad boss fights and anything else that's gameplay related will not be considered. I'm only looking at how the characters are written. I'm also gonna be harsher on villains if they play an important role in the game. An early game mini-boss with a generic personality is not as big of a deal as a main villain with a generic personality. And finally, there will be spoilers in this video for every Xenoblade game. But without any further ado, let's talk about the 5 worst Xenoblade villains. So, when I told some of my friends that I was making this video, 2 of them immediately said, "Oh, Laura's evil stepfather has to be close to number 1, right?" I was honestly surprised to hear that, because I don't think of Gord as one of the all-time worst Xenoblade villains. In the end, he did barely become my number 5, but I do want to clear something up. This is not a video about my most hated characters. I despise Gord for all the terrible things he did to Laura, but this top 5 is only about how underwhelming or disappointing some villains are. The main reason why I think Gord is a letdown has to do with his role in the story of Torna the Golden Country. So let's get into that. Okay, so for the first few hours of Torna, I actually have zero problems with him. Gord manages to corner Laura, which is a good setup for a boss fight, and it's just satisfying to beat him up. I do think it's kinda stupid that Gord somehow manages to escape despite him being surrounded and Hugo sending 3 soldiers after him. But you know what? Sure, I can look past that as well. My real problem starts here, however. Gord gets caught by Indol, he gets experimented on, and we don't see him again for 10 hours of gameplay. Gord only appears again at the very end of the game. Hello! Many people don't like this part of the ending, and I still don't know how to feel about it myself. On the one hand, it really just feels as if the writers forgot about Gord when coming up with the story and then quickly threw him in at the end. But on the other hand, I can kinda justify why the fight is here. I think there definitely had to be a second fight against Gord, there's no question about that. I think it's also thematically fitting that Laura is all alone with just her blades during both fights with Gord, and it's just kinda hard to find another moment like that during any other point in the story of Torna. All in all, I like the idea of Laura getting to confront her abuser, but I don't like the execution of it. You could also say that Gord as a character is just really simple. He's a thief slash mercenary, I think. He wants revenge on Jin for cutting his arm off, and he's basically irredeemably evil. That's it. However, I think that's fine for one reason. Gord is an abusive parent. I don't think a character like that should have a sympathetic backstory or a charismatic personality. No, just make him as hateable as possible so we have absolutely no problem smashing his face in. I don't think I can put Gord much higher on this top 5 because my only real problem with him is his somewhat janky implementation in the story. I don't think his personality is a big problem considering the kind of character he's meant to be. The next 4 characters on this list might not be as hateable as Gord, but I definitely have way more problems with their roles in their stories. So, remember how the villains of Xenoblade 2 had a group that was named after Torna? Yeah, I have some mixed feelings on this group. Of course, I love Jin and Malos, but the other 3 members felt criminally underused in the story. I'm not the biggest Akos fan, but at least he feels somewhat important. He's clearly the brains behind the group and he shows up multiple times to be a nuisance. For Mikhail, it's the exact opposite. I like him as a character, but he didn't get to do much until the end of the story. I wish we saw more of him, especially when it comes to his relationship with Jin. But every now and then their bond did shine through, and Mikhail's sacrifice was just beautiful. So that just leaves Petroka, who's my number 4 worst Xenoblade villain. It just feels like she adds next to nothing to the overall story. In most of the scenes she's in, she gets hit on by Mikhail and then she tells him to kill himself. She has 2 boss fights alongside Mikhail and later Akos, but it's not like these fights are that important to the story, and for the rest, she doesn't do anything noteworthy. But you know, Mick also didn't get to do much, but at least he had a memorable death cutscene. Maybe Petroka will get something similar. Nah, Petroka just gets killed out of nowhere by Amalthus, and it's only then that we get to know more about her past. And here's the thing, the story about her and Akos being the blades of 2 siblings, Akos seeing her as his real sister and being content as long as they have each other, that's touching. It does make me feel sympathetic for them. But it's only told to us when Petroka is already dead and when Akos is about to be dead. I feel sorry for Akos since his sister was clearly important to him and we get to see his emotional last stand, but Petroka got nothing. Petroka was done so dirty. She didn't get to do anything for the whole game and her death is just used to give Akos his brief time to shine. On top of that, I just have a few small annoyances with Petroka. When you first defeat her and Mikhail, Petroka gets mad and reveals she has some kind of hidden power. Oh, you can't use that here, Petroka. Oh, I can't wait until the story reveals what that was about. And then this moment is never acknowledged again for the rest of the game. I guess this was foreshadowing that she's actually a flesh eater and these are just supposed to be her blade powers, but it's so lame that they're just never mentioned again. And for one last nitpick, the eyes on her character model just don't look right in some scenes. Like, look at this. In the end, I just feel sorry for Petroka. She really deserves to be treated better in every way. Oh yeah, it's Mobin time! Okay, most Mobius members are one-dimensional bad guys, and I'm partially fine with that. It's what I said at the beginning of the video. I'm not gonna be harsh on minor villains that don't play a big role in the story, and most consoles are exactly that. They usually only appear in one hero quest and then die at the end of them, so it's not like it's worth delving into their motivations or backstories when they have maybe 10 minutes of screen time. All of that is why I can live with most Mobius being so generic. However, I do expect something more from the people in charge of Mobius. I didn't want to put 4 different Mobius on this list, so I'm only gonna pick one, and it's definitely a toss-up between X, Y or Z. Z is definitely the most underwhelming main villain from the main trilogy. He feels more like the final boss of a Persona game, in the sense that he's not really a character and more an embodiment of an idea, in this case the fear of the future. Thankfully for Z, he's the embodiment of an interesting idea. I think he represents it well during the final boss, and I also like that he preys on that exact fear with N to manipulate him into joining Mobius. Z still doesn't do much outside of this and he doesn't have much of a personality, but he's still way better than X and Y. These two are supposed to be some of the first Mobius members right next to Z, and yet they're both bland characters that feel completely unimportant to the story. If I had to pick one of them to put on this top 5, I guess I would go with Y. X at least plays a role in chapter 5 and is around in more hero quests. Y, on the other hand, is not even encountered by the main party until the end of chapter 6. He's technically important to the story as he apparently invented flame clocks, but for the rest he's basically treated the same as other Mobius. Actually, in some ways he and X are treated worse, because when you fight them in Origin they straight up don't have a death cutscene. Mobius as a whole are shown to be replaceable. The role of Console Q, for example, was filled by different people in the base game and in Future Redeemed. So I guess the game is saying that X and Y are just as insignificant as any of these other guys? Look, to repeat myself, I understand why most other Mobius don't have much to work with, because they're just not around for long in the story. I do think it's fair to expect more out of X and Y, who are basically Z's second in command. And yet, these two are less interesting than some of the other random consoles. It felt like the writers didn't even try with them. I'm sure some people would say that Xenoblade 3 has the worst villains in the series, but my vote would definitely go to Xenoblade X instead. Most Mobius are lame, but there are also a few good ones, like N, M if you count her as a villain, and some decent ones like J and Shania. Meanwhile, if you don't count a certain anti-hero, Xenoblade X just doesn't have any good villains. This whole top 5 could have easily existed out of only Mobius and Ganglion, but again, I'm only gonna pick one villain from X. I think most people would pick Luxar, who's basically the main villain. It's just impossible to take this guy seriously. He constantly loses his temper over the smallest things, and at one point he even starts screaming that no one in his army is listening to him. The one interesting thing about him is the reason he and Ganglion fear humans, but it's only told to us at the end of the game. Zed might be the worst villain from the trilogy, but Luxar is easily the weakest of all main villains in the Xenoblade series. If I had to choose the worst Xenoblade X villain, Luxar would definitely be the right choice. Now let me explain why I chose Goetia instead. She's the first recurring villain you encounter in Xenoblade X, and seeing as Luxar doesn't even appear until chapter 6, she's basically the most important villain for a while. There's not much noteworthy about her. She has the exact same generic rants about humans being a cancer that every Ganglion member has, and the camera zooms in on her ass way too often. Here's the main reason I wanted to talk about Goetia. On my first playthrough, I didn't even realize she died. After I beat the game, someone had to tell me that she died after her boss fight in chapter 7. So I'm just gonna show you the moment of her death.
She was this strong when I needed to
My
be.
cooking got bad.
Yep, you see her burning skull in the background of a cutscene and it's just implied that she's dead. By the way, during this whole scene, no one confirms she's dead and nobody even mentions her. This has to be the most unceremonious death in the whole series. Okay, I'm not kidding with this next part. When Xenoblade X Definitive Edition was announced, I had a theory that Goetia would come back as one of the villains in the epilogue. Yeah, of course that didn't happen, but come on! Isn't it a rule in this series that you can never assume a character is dead unless the death is explicitly shown to you? I'm sticking to my Schrodinger's Goetia theory. There's no way to know if she's dead or alive until it's actually confirmed to us or until she returns in a future game, guys. So, as I said before that long tangent, you can make a good case for Luxar being the worst villain in X. However, I'd say Goetia is just as one-dimensional as him, and Luxar at least gives us some exposition on the Samarians while having some funny moments, whether they were intentional or not. If I did not pick only one villain per game, they would probably be number 2 and 3 on this list anyway. But now, the moment you've been waiting for! Let's see who's the number 1 worst Xenoblade villain. Half of the people watching this must have been waiting for me to rip into this guy, and the other half might not even be aware of this guy's existence. So, for the people unaware, let's talk about Future Connected. Back in 2020, this was a new side story all about Melia, and they needed some new antagonists for the story. On a totally unrelated note, meet Gelgar. Within the first minute of meeting him, he says he hates Machina and pure-blooded High Entia. No guys, of course he's not evil. How could he be when he loves half-blooded High Entia like Melia? Anyways, just forget about him, because he doesn't appear again for a few hours in the story. The very next time you see him, he's trying to stop Tilan's research on the old High Entia. I'll give him this. At this point, Gelgar was still somewhat interesting. He is someone that wants Melia to become a queen, and he only turns against you when Melia refuses to treat pure-blooded High Entia as inferior or useless. Gelgar is still lacking in depth for now, but that's fine, we're only halfway done with Future Connected story. Unfortunately, it's all downhill from here. So after the boss fight, Gelgar blows up Tilan's lab and takes him hostage. But, and I can't even make this up, Gelgar gets knocked over by a Telefia, he gives up and then runs away. And that, my friends, is the last we saw of Gelgar for the whole main story. He seriously showed up, said he was racist, refused to elaborate, and then ran away. If you really want to know how the story of Gelgar ends, you have to do a side quest. That's insane. The quest isn't even that special. What he says here is basically a repeat of what he said during the boss fight. Gelgar is planning to overthrow Melia and become the new ruler of the High Entia himself. I don't know if he seriously expected all other High Entia to just accept him as their new ruler, but that doesn't matter because of course he loses again. And then the side quest ends like this. Guys, we technically didn't see Gelgar die. Yeah, so way before my stupid Goetia theory, I had a stupid Gelgar theory. And in my defense, Future Connected was said to be a teaser for the future of the series. So, shortly before Xenoblade 3 came out, I had a crazy theory that Gelgar or his actions would have been important in that game and maybe be the reason why Melia seems to be evil. But no, none of this was important in Future Connected or the future of the series. So what was the point of Gelgar? There's already so much going on in Future Connected story. We already have a main villain with the Fog King, there's already another conflict between the companions and the residents of Grandel. We did not need a random racism subplot that took up a grand total of 15 minutes. It could have been interesting, but it just ends up going nowhere. All the villains from the top 3 onwards feel pointless to some extent, but I think Gelgar really has it the worst. Console Y and Goetia at least have the excuse of being one of many Ganglion or Mobius. But Gelgar is the only villain of his side story to have a speaking role and is still completely sidelined. But hey, at least he makes for good meme potential. Villains like these are thankfully outliers in the Xenoblade series. In fact, I struggled to find even 5 villains to put on this list that weren't all Mobius or Ganglion. I'm just hoping the series can keep up the status quo and not give me even more outliers in the next Xeno title. Anyways, thanks for watching the video, subscribe for more Xenoblade. This has been Maxmonado, signing out.